Ethan Walker sat in the back of the limousine, his eyes glued to the window as the city lights flashed by. He couldn't help but reflect on the years that had passed since the breakup with Emily. It had been a long time, yet the sting of it all still lingered beneath the surface, though he refused to acknowledge it most of the time. He had built a reputation, created an empire, and surrounded himself with people who respected him not for his wealth, but for his acumen and ability to lead. Emily's departure hadn't broken him. It had propelled him forward. But now, his past was suddenly thrust back into his life. Emily had become the CEO of one of the largest companies in the country, and her engagement to Ryan Mitchell, a wealthy businessman who was known for his arrogance, had made headlines everywhere. The thought of Emily with someone like Ryan didn't sit well with Ethan. It wasn't the relationship that bothered him. It was the man. Ryan was exactly the kind of person Ethan despised. Flashy, superficial, and far more concerned with status than substance. The very kind of man Emily had rejected him for. The limo pulled up to the venue, a grand gala that was being held in honor of Emily's new position as CEO. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he stepped out of the car, his gaze scanning the crowd. He wasn't here to make friends. He wasn't even here to support Emily, though the invitation had been extended with the usual polite formality. No, Ethan was here because of one thing: revenge, not on Emily herself, but on the situation. He had been a silent player in his own life for too long. He was no longer going to be the passive observer of his own story. It was time for the world to see the real Ethan Walker, and more importantly, for Emily to see what she had left behind. As he entered the ballroom, he was immediately struck by the opulence around him. Every detail screamed excess. It was the world that Emily had always longed for: glamour, luxury, and the promise of an easy life filled with shallow connections and superficial success. But Ethan had built his empire from the ground up, every step driven by grit and determination. There was no inheritance or silver spoon involved in his rise. He had earned every dollar and every bit of respect he had. He caught sight of Emily almost immediately. She was standing at the center of the room, radiant in a designer gown, surrounded by an entourage of business elites and high-profile individuals. She was everything he remembered: beautiful, poised, and commanding attention effortlessly. But something in her eyes had changed. There was a certain emptiness there now. The warmth that once made her so approachable was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated expression. His heart didn't flutter, nor did a sense of nostalgia wash over him. No, what he felt was something different, something far more potent. He had outgrown her, outgrown everything they once had. Yet the undeniable pull she still had over him stirred something deep inside. It was not love, he was long past that, but something else, a mixture of desire and unfinished business. And then he saw him, Ryan Mitchell. He was exactly what Ethan had imagined: tall, muscular, and dressed in a suit that likely cost more than some people's entire yearly salary. He was standing by Emily's side, whispering into her ear, making her laugh as if she were a toy to be played with. Ethan felt a surge of disdain. This was the man Emily had chosen to replace him. This man who looked down on everything Ethan had worked for. As Ethan walked further into the room, he noticed Ryan's eyes narrow in his direction. There was no mistaking it. The tension in the air was palpable. Ryan was sizing him up. Ethan could practically hear the thoughts running through his mind. Who is this guy? And why does he think he belongs here? Ryan's smug smile only added fuel to the fire. He was obviously confident, but Ethan knew better. Confidence could be easily shattered, especially when someone like him entered the picture. It didn't take long before their paths crossed. Ryan, still with that arrogant grin plastered on his face, approached Ethan with all the bravado of a man who had everything to prove. "Ethan Walker," Ryan said, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." His tone was dismissive, as if he was humoring a child. Ethan glanced at Ryan's hand for a moment before offering a firm handshake. He wasn't here to play games, and he wasn't going to let this arrogant man rattle him. "You've heard about me, huh?" Ethan replied coolly. "I'm sure it's not as impressive as what you've heard about yourself." Ryan chuckled, clearly amused by Ethan's directness. "You know, Emily talks about you occasionally, but she's moved on, obviously. She's doing quite well, wouldn't you agree?" Ethan's eyes flickered toward Emily, who was watching the exchange from a distance. The briefest flash of something, concern maybe, crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a smile as she turned her attention back to the crowd. Ethan didn't let the moment linger. "I'm happy for her. She always had big dreams," he said, keeping his voice even. but there was an edge in his tone. You, on the other hand, I don't really know much about. Ryan's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. I'm sure I'll give you plenty of reasons to remember me. He gave Ethan a wink, and then his eyes shifted, glancing over to Emily. After all, I've already got the girl. Ethan felt a small pang of something deep inside. But it wasn't jealousy. It was more like resentment. This man had taken something from him that he could never get back, and that thought gnawed at him more than it should have. You don't have her, Ryan, Ethan said quietly, his eyes locking onto Ryan's. You may have her now, but trust me, you'll never have her like I did. Ryan's smirk faded just slightly, but he was quick to cover it up. Sure, Ethan. Whatever you say. Just keep your distance, all right? We wouldn't want you to get in the way of real success. Ethan let the words roll off his back. The audacity of this man to compare himself to Ethan was laughable. He was about to say something more, but then he saw Emily moving toward them, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She stood beside Ryan, and he couldn't help but notice the way she looked at him. Just for a moment, a flicker of something in her eyes that told him she wasn't entirely happy with the situation. Everything all right here? Emily asked, her tone light, but with an underlying tension. Ethan took a step back, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. Everything's fine, Emily. I'm just getting reacquainted with your fiancé. His words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ryan gave a tight smile, clearly uncomfortable, but he recovered quickly. Ethan was just reminding me of the past. Nothing to worry about. Emily's gaze flickered between the two men. There was a momentary hesitation in her expression, as if she was unsure where her loyalties truly lay. Ethan wasn't here for Emily, not in the way she might have hoped. He was here to prove a point, to himself, to her, and to Ryan. A point that would resonate louder than anything Emily had ever done before. As he turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder, locking eyes with Emily. You've come far, Emily, but be careful who you choose to stand beside. And with that, Ethan walked away, leaving Emily and Ryan standing there, unsure of the storm that was coming for them. The night stretched on, filled with shallow conversations and champagne-soaked laughter. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The high society mingled around him, but he was no longer interested in pretending to fit in with them. His eyes were constantly drawn back to Emily and Ryan. Their closeness, the way Ryan always seemed to have his hand on her back, guiding her like a trophy. Everything about their dynamic felt wrong. It was unsettling, not just because of the obvious, Emily had moved on, but because of the sheer inauthenticity of it all. For a brief moment, he caught Emily looking at him again, this time more intently. There was something there, something that wasn't just the polite interest of an ex-wife or a CEO hosting an event. It was longing, but it was quickly masked behind a professional smile as she turned her attention back to the crowd, seemingly lost in the game she now played. Ethan felt a sharp twinge in his chest, but it wasn't the kind of pain he expected. This was not the heartache of losing someone he once loved. This was the irritation of knowing that she was now a pawn in her own game, just like everyone else in this ballroom. Emily had once been real, authentic, and now she was drowning in the persona she'd created. Ethan had always prided himself on being true to who he was, even if that meant making enemies or taking risks. But Emily, she'd chosen the easy route, and it stung to watch her live a life so clearly devoid of the spark that once made her truly special. I see you're still not shy about causing a scene. Ethan turned to find none other than Olivia Miller, one of the few people from his past who had stayed close to him. She had always been someone who cut through the bullshit, and tonight was no different. What's going on? She asked, eyeing the direction of Emily and Ryan with a raised brow. This feels like an old-fashioned grudge being played out on the grand stage. You're not here to win her back, are you? Ethan's lips twisted into a smile. Olivia had always been direct, but she had a point. Ethan didn't want Emily back, not in the way he once had. That ship had sailed long ago, and he was now sailing in a new direction. But watching her with Ryan, seeing the fake smile on her face, the controlled gestures, something inside him clicked. He didn't need her, but he needed to expose the lies. He needed to remind her, and Ryan, that Ethan Walker was not someone they could simply forget. No, Ethan said, his voice low but clear. I'm not here to win her back. I'm here to remind her who I am. Olivia's sharp eyes studied him for a moment. She had always seen through him, and right now, she could tell there was something beneath the surface. You think you can ruin their perfect little world? She asked. her voice filled with amusement but also caution. Ethan's gaze hardened as he looked toward Emily and Ryan. He didn't want to destroy her life. He wanted to shatter the illusion that she had built for herself. He wanted to expose the truth about Ryan, about the things people didn't see behind the perfect facade. People like Ryan, with their polished smiles and polished lives, often had secrets that could bring everything crumbling down. I'm not interested in ruining anything, but people like Ryan, they need to be shown for what they are. And as for Emily, she needs to remember that I'm still here, and I'm not the man she thinks I am. Olivia chuckled softly. I think this is more personal than you're letting on. Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A name he hadn't seen in years flashed across the display. Mark Jansen. Mark Jansen. The message was simple, but it stopped Ethan in his tracks. We need to talk. There's something you need to know about Emily and Ryan. It's bigger than you think. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Mark Jansen had been a former business partner, a man who knew things, shady things, about the high-powered elite. He had always been on the periphery of Ethan's world, helping him with under-the-table deals when necessary. But what would Mark want now? And why did it have anything to do with Emily? Ethan's mind raced. Was this about Ryan? Was there something in his past that could bring him down? Emily had always been meticulous about keeping her personal life separate from her professional life. But Ethan knew that sometimes the lines weren't so clear. Who's that? Olivia asked, noticing the sudden shift in Ethan's demeanor. No one, Ethan said quickly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. But his mind was already working overtime, piecing together the possibilities. He could feel the weight of the situation, the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. This wasn't just about old wounds. This was about something much bigger and more dangerous. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself growing increasingly impatient. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, perhaps a sign, perhaps a crack in Emily's perfect life that would allow him to expose the truth. Whatever it wasn't coming. He stood near the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his face. Below him, the lights of the city stretched out in every direction, a sea of promises and lies. But even in the midst of it all, Ethan felt something stirring within him, a desire for control, a hunger for vengeance that had been buried deep inside him for so long. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard a familiar voice behind him. Ethan. It was Emily. She had approached quietly, but Ethan could hear the tension in her voice. She wasn't here for small talk. I didn't expect to see you here tonight, she said, her words cautious, as if she wasn't entirely sure of his intentions. Ethan didn't turn to face her immediately. Instead, he continued to look out at the city, his jaw tight with the weight of his thoughts. Did you? He asked, his voice low. Did you expect me to stay away forever? Emily's silence was telling. When she spoke again, there was something more vulnerable in her tone. I never wanted things to end like they did between us, Ethan. Finally, Ethan turned to face her. The years had passed, but there was still something there. He could see the cracks in her facade now, the uncertainty that she had so carefully hidden beneath her perfect exterior. You didn't want things to end? Ethan asked softly, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. Then why did you let it all go, Emily? Why did you choose him over me? Emily flinched, her eyes flashing with something akin to regret, or perhaps guilt. But before she could answer, Ryan's voice called out from behind them. Everything all right here, Emily? Ryan asked, his tone dripping with arrogance. Ethan could feel the tension build in the air as Emily turned toward Ryan, a subtle but clear shift in her demeanor as she slid back into the role of the dutiful fiancé. The moment passed, and whatever spark of vulnerability had flickered between them was gone, replaced by the cold, hard exterior of the woman who had moved on. Of course, Emily replied, her voice back to its practiced neutrality. Ethan and I were just catching up. Ryan shot Ethan a look of disdain before he stepped closer to Emily, wrapping an arm around her waist. Well, now that you've had your trip down memory lane, shall we get back to the party? Ethan watched them, the weight of the words he had just shared hanging in the air. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But for now, he would bide his time. The pieces were falling into place. Emily and Ryan's perfect little world was about to come crashing down, and Ethan Walker would be the one to make sure it happened. Ethan could barely concentrate on the rest of the event. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and idle chatter felt like a distant hum, a world he no longer belonged to. He was surrounded by people who were more interested in their champagne flutes than the games being played in the shadows. But Ethan wasn't there to entertain them. He was there to settle a score, A score that had nothing to do with his ex-wife's sudden rise to the top, and everything to do with the man standing next to her. Ryan Connors was the man he wanted to break, but there was something more lurking beneath the surface. Mark Jansen's cryptic message still weighed on him. There's something you need to know about Emily and Ryan. It's bigger than you think. The more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. What was Mark hinting at? What could possibly link Emily to Ryan beyond their obvious relationship? For the next hour, Ethan lingered in the background of the event, his eyes scanning the room, always coming back to Emily and Ryan. Every time they spoke, he noticed the way Ryan's hand would casually rest on Emily's back, or how he seemed to dictate her every move, even her conversations. Ethan had been in the game long enough to spot the cracks in any perfect portrait, and this one was badly painted. Finally, his phone buzzed again. It was Mark Jansen. "Meet me at the back entrance. I'll tell you everything." Ethan didn't hesitate. Without another word, he excused himself from Olivia and made his way toward the exit. His mind was racing, but one thought kept repeating itself. Why Emily? Why was she involved in something deeper than just her CEO position? As Ethan moved through the back halls of the event, he couldn't shake the feeling of Emily's gaze following him earlier. He wasn't sure if it was real or just wishful thinking, but he had noticed it. She was still tied to him in some way, even if she pretended not to be. Back in the main hall, Emily stood at the center of a group, her professional smile firmly in place. But even from across the room, Ethan could tell something was off. Her eyes flitted nervously to the door as if waiting for someone or something to interrupt her. Was it him she was watching? Was she unsure of the life she had built with Ryan? "Are you okay?" The voice snapped her back to reality. Ryan stood beside her, his arm possessively draped around her waist. He was watching her carefully, sensing something wasn't quite right. He didn't ask it, but Emily could feel the unspoken demand for her to assure him that everything was fine. Emily's pulse quickened, her mind racing. The last thing she wanted was for Ryan to see the cracks in her. She had worked too hard to build the life they now shared. She had become the woman she was because of Ryan, because of the power he represented. He was the key to everything. And now, as Ethan's figure lingered in the periphery, she could feel that power slipping away. "I'm fine," Emily said quickly, forcing a smile. "It's nothing." Ryan didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push her further. "Let's make sure it stays that way," he said, his tone laced with a quiet threat. "You have everything now. Don't ruin it." Her chest tightened as he walked away, and for the briefest moment, Emily felt a surge of panic. Was she truly happy? Had she traded her own happiness for the security of wealth, status, and control? Ethan found Mark standing just outside the back entrance, his figure illuminated by the dim lights of the alley. Mark was always the type to blend into the shadows, preferring the background to the spotlight. But tonight, there was an edge to his presence that made Ethan pause. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mark remarked dryly, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "Come on, you wanted answers." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Start talking." Mark flicked his cigarette away and gestured for Ethan to follow him into a nearby, more secluded area. As they walked, Mark's face grew serious, and his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "You've been wondering why Emily's with Ryan, right?" Mark asked, his gaze darting around to make sure no one was listening. "It's not what you think. Sure, she's got her own reasons for being with him, but this goes deeper than just love or money." Ethan's breath caught. "What the hell do you mean?" Mark hesitated, clearly weighing whether or not he should reveal everything. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "Ryan isn't who he says he is. He's connected to some very dangerous people, people that you and I know well, even if you've chosen to forget them. And Emily's tangled up in all of it." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "What kind of people are we talking about?" Mark's eyes darkened. "The kind that you don't cross. The kind that has the power to ruin your life in ways you can't even imagine. Ryan's been laundering money through her company, through her connections. He used her, and now she's trapped. She's too deep in it to get out." Ethan was silent for a long moment as the weight of Mark's words sunk in. Emily, the woman he had once loved, was not just a CEO. She was complicit in something far worse than betrayal. This wasn't just about their marriage falling apart. This was about corruption, about deceit, and about people playing with power on a scale he couldn't have imagined. Mark's eyes narrowed, reading the shock on Ethan's face. "You need to decide, Ethan. This isn't something you can ignore. If you walk away, nothing changes. But if you expose it, everything changes. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could walk away, let Emily live in her world of lies and deceit, or he could tear it all down. He wasn't sure what he wanted more, revenge or redemption. Back at the venue, Emily found herself alone in a quiet corner, her thoughts spiraling out of control. The night had taken an unexpected turn. She had always known that her life with Ryan came with risks, but she hadn't expected the guilt to start creeping in. She had built this life, this empire, but at what cost? Was the man she'd chosen truly the person she wanted by her side? Or had she been seduced by the power he wielded? Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Ryan. "Come find me. We need to talk. It's time." Her stomach churned as she read the message. What was he planning? And what did he need to tell her? The clock was ticking, and Emily knew that every choice she made from here on out would either bind her further to Ryan or lead her down a path that could change everything. But there was no turning back now. Ethan walked through the back corridors of the venue with the heavy weight of Mark's revelation pressing on his chest. The world had shifted under his feet, and the calm veneer he had been holding onto was crumbling. He had known Emily for years, loved her in ways that had once seemed like they would last forever. But the woman she had become now was a stranger to him, someone who had traded her soul for power, for control. Was it too late to save her? Or was she already lost in the very things she had built? His thoughts were interrupted by a buzzing sound from his phone. A text from Olivia. "Where are you? The event's about to end. Ryan's looking for you." A surge of annoyance rushed through Ethan, but he ignored the message. This wasn't about Ryan anymore. This was about Emily, and the truth that he had to expose before it was too late. But part of him felt a strange pull to her. He wasn't ready to let go, not yet, and the anger inside him only burned brighter the more he thought about what Ryan had done to her, and to him. Without replying to Olivia, Ethan pushed forward, his steps leading him out of the hidden area into the bustling hall. He could feel Ryan's eyes on him the moment he entered, his presence too commanding to ignore. Ryan had never been one for subtlety. He was the type of man who thrived on dominance, on making others feel small. And today, Ethan wasn't the only one feeling small. Emily found Ryan standing near the grand staircase, a dark silhouette against the grandiose backdrop of chandeliers and marble. He didn't look like the man she had once believed was her savior. Instead, he looked more like the villain in her own story, and yet, she couldn't walk away from him. She had been too entangled in his web for too long. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Ryan asked coldly, his eyes studying her with the calculated precision of a man who knew everything about you but refused to share his own truths. Emily forced a smile, but the effort felt hollow. "I just need a moment to breathe." Ryan's lips curled into a smirk, the same one he wore when he was in control. "I thought you were past needing to catch your breath. You've built this empire, Em. All this success, all this power. You wanted it. You knew the price." Emily flinched at his words, even though she knew they were true. She had chosen this life. She had chosen him. But as her thoughts turned to Ethan and the cryptic words Mark had shared with her, doubt began to creep in. Had I really chosen this? But before she could finish, Ryan was already stepping closer, his hands locking around her waist, pulling her against him. His touch was possessive, and for a moment, Emily could feel the weight of his influence pressing down on her. She had always feared his coldness, but tonight, there was something different in his touch. There was an undercurrent of desperation she had never noticed before. "Don't start second-guessing now," Ryan whispered, his lips brushing against her ear. "You're mine, Emily. You always have been." Her body tensed at his words, and for a fleeting moment, she thought of Ethan, how he had once held her, how his love had been different, freer. But those memories were quickly drowned by the reality of the life she had built with Ryan. She had no room for second thoughts. "Don't tell me how I feel," she muttered, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I've made my choices. I'm not the woman you think I am anymore." Ryan's eyes darkened at her defiance. "We both know that's not true. You're exactly the woman I made you. You're powerful because of me, and you'll stay that way as long as you play your part." Emily's chest tightened at his words, but she didn't answer. Instead, she pulled away from him, trying to regain some control over herself. She had to make a decision. She couldn't keep living like this. Across the room, Ethan watched the scene unfold between Emily and Ryan. His fists clenched at his sides as his eyes darted from Emily's strained expression to to Ryan's smug face. He could feel the tension in the air, the electricity between them, thick and charged. Ethan couldn't let it go. This was his chance, the moment he had been waiting for. With steady steps, he moved toward them, a quiet storm brewing in his chest. "Ryan," Ethan's voice cut through the noise of the room, sharp and direct. Ryan turned at the sound of Ethan's voice, a flicker of annoyance flashing across his face. "What do you want, Ethan? Didn't you get the memo? This is a private conversation." But Ethan wasn't backing down. His eyes locked on Ryan's, his gaze cold and unwavering. "I want to talk to you about what's going on here. I want to know what you've done to her." Emily's eyes widened in shock, and for a brief moment, she looked torn. But before she could speak, Ryan was already moving, stepping between them, his posture defensive. "This doesn't concern you anymore, Ethan," Ryan said, his voice low and dangerous. "You had your chance with Emily. You left her. Now she's with me, and you'll stay the hell out of it." Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. "You think you have power over her? Over me?" Ryan's face twisted in anger, but Ethan wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice steady but full of threat. "I've spent years building a legacy you can only dream of, and I'll be damned if I let you use her as a pawn in your game." Ryan's hand shot out, grabbing Ethan by the collar and shoving him back. The tension in the air thickened as the room seemed to hold its breath. But Ethan didn't flinch. He met Ryan's eyes with cold defiance. "I'll bring it all down, Ryan," Ethan said, his voice full of a quiet, menacing confidence. "You're not invincible." The moment hung in the air, heavy and charged, and Emily stood frozen, torn between the two men. She had always known this moment would come, the moment when everything would fracture. The question was, which man would she stand by? Would she stay with Ryan and continue her rise to power? Or would she abandon it all for Ethan, the man who had once loved her? Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Enough." Both men turned to her in unison, and for the first time that night, Emily felt the weight of the situation settle around her. She had to make a choice. "I've been living in the shadows of your power games for too long," she continued, her eyes locked with Ryan's. "I thought I could control this, but I was wrong." Ryan's face twisted in rage, but Emily didn't back down. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she slowly reached into her purse and pulled out a file, evidence of Ryan's illegal activities, of everything he had done behind the scenes, the truth she had buried for too long. "This is over," she said, her voice steely. "I'm done." Ethan watched in stunned silence as Emily handed over the file, her decision made. Ryan's world was crumbling before his eyes. And now, it was Ethan's turn to take back what he had lost. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan stood there watching Emily as she confronted Ryan with the file, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always believed in Emily, but this moment, this shift in power, was something he hadn't anticipated. She had always been strong, but never like this. Never so resolute. Ryan, on the other hand, was not the man who looked untouchable anymore. His facade of control cracked as he stared at Emily with disbelief, his jaw tight and his eyes narrowing in anger. "You think this will change anything?" Ryan's voice was low, filled with venom. "You can't just walk away from everything we've built. You think you have the power to destroy me?" Emily didn't flinch. She opened the file slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she laid the evidence on the table in front of Ryan. The room grew quieter as the realization began to dawn on him. It was all there. The illegal contracts, the shady deals, the money laundering that had funded Ryan's empire. And it was all about to come crumbling down. "I don't care about what we built," Emily said, her voice unwavering. "It was never real. Not when it was built on lies, deceit, and betrayal. And I won't let you take me down with you." Ryan's eyes flashed with rage. He moved towards her, but Ethan was already there, stepping between them, his presence a solid wall. His voice was cold as he looked at Ryan. "It's over, Ryan. This is where it ends." Ryan paused, looking at Ethan as if he were seeing him for the first time. "You think she'll choose you? After everything?" His voice dripped with scorn. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his attention to Emily. Her gaze was intense, determined, but there was a vulnerability there too, something raw and exposed. This was her moment, and for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't the one protecting her. She was protecting herself. "I'm not here to compete with you, Ryan," Ethan said slowly, his voice steady. "I'm here to give her a chance at freedom, a chance to live her life the way she deserves." Ryan's expression darkened, and in a swift movement, He lunged at Ethan, knocking the file to the ground in the process. But Ethan was faster. He grabbed Ryan's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground with a precision that was both controlled and unyielding. "Get him out of here," Ethan said, his tone icy. A few of the security personnel, who had been watching from a distance, rushed forward, quickly pulling Ryan away. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now being dragged out of the building in front of everyone. Emily watched in silence, her heart pounding, a strange mix of relief and fear gripping her. As Ryan was escorted away, the room seemed to exhale collectively. The weight of his presence was gone, and with it, the oppressive air that had haunted Emily for so long. She stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. She had just dismantled everything she had built with Ryan. Ethan moved toward her, his gaze softening as he approached. The space between them had never felt so vast, yet at the same time, it felt like the years that had kept them apart were starting to dissolve. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "I don't know. I think I've been living someone else's life for too long." Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. She had been living in the shadow of Ryan's ambitions, always chasing success, always trying to prove herself in a world that didn't care about the price she paid. But now, she had the chance to find her own path. "It's not too late, Emily," Ethan said quietly. "You don't have to do this alone." A flicker of something, hope perhaps, passed through Emily's eyes. But the walls that had once been so easily breached were still there, and she found herself stepping back from Ethan, her expression conflicted. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," she whispered, almost to herself. "Not after everything I've been through, not after everything I've done." Ethan's heart ached as he saw the pain in her eyes. He had always known her to be strong, but now he could see the cracks in her armor. The woman who had once been full of ambition and fire now seemed tired, lost even. But in that moment, he realized something profound. She didn't need him to save her. She needed him to stand beside her as she saved herself. "You don't have to trust anyone right now," Ethan replied, his voice soft but firm. "You just need to take one step at a time, and I'll be here no matter what." Emily turned away, her gaze drifting toward the open doors, as if the answers she sought lay just beyond them. She was silent for a long moment, processing everything, the pain, the loss, the choices she had made. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I need some time, Ethan, to think, to figure out who I am now that everything has changed." Ethan took a step closer, but didn't press. He understood. He had always understood her need for space. He just hoped she would find her way back to him. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "But know this, you're not alone." As Emily walked away, her steps slow and deliberate, Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This wasn't the end, not for them, not for her. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could reclaim her life, one where they could both heal and rebuild together if she was ready. The weeks following Ryan's fall from grace were filled with chaos. The media exploded with news of his corruption, his ties to illicit deals, and the many lies he had spun over the years. His empire crumbled faster than anyone could have predicted, and Emily's actions were lauded as a bold move toward justice. But despite the public outpouring of support, Emily felt strangely isolated, as though she were standing alone in a crowd. She kept to herself, working tirelessly to keep the company afloat, trying to rebuild the reputation she had once sacrificed everything for. But in the quiet moments, when she sat alone in her office or lay awake at night, the weight of her choices pressed down on her. What was she really working toward? Was it just another version of the life she had walked away from? Or was it something different, something true? Ethan remained in the background, giving her the space she needed while still checking in on her regularly. He never pushed, never demanded anything from her. But Emily knew, deep down, that he was the only one who truly understood her. And in the midst of the chaos, as she found herself facing a future that seemed both uncertain and full of potential, Emily realized one thing. She had the power to create her own story. She wasn't just a character in someone else's narrative anymore. She was the author. But would she have the courage to write the next chapter? Sometimes the real victory isn't in the confrontation. It's in the silence after the storm. If you're ready to see how the past shapes the present and how power shifts in the most unexpected ways, stay tuned. The final chapter has just begun.